So, as I just said, my name is Justin Ricks. I'm a partner at Grant Thornton in our people advisory practice, and I'm co-presenting with my colleague Maddie, who I'll hand over to just in a second, to introduce herself. But before I do that, what we thought would be useful would just be to do a very quick run through of what Maddie and I are going to be talking about. Clearly, from a change perspective, there's been a huge amount of transformational change, and that's been across all industries. So firstly, what we thought we'd do is a bit of scene setting and context in terms of the current landscape and how this is impacting on the people agenda and the role and function of HR. We then will follow that with a bit of a deeper dive into a number of the immediate areas of focus from an HR perspective, and then finish off with a bit of crystal ball gazing around how this might shape the future of the HR function. Now, what we did during the presentation in our masterclass was we had some poll questions which we asked. We will include. We did ask a number of those, and we'll include that in this session. But there's also a number of the ones that we didn't manage to ask, just to kind of help you give some thought about how this all applies to your organisation. So at this point, I'll hand over to Maddie and let her introduce herself.
Thanks, Justin. Hi, everyone. I'm Maddie Wallerton-Blanks, and I'm an Associate Director in our People Advisory practice. I work on the consulting side of People Advisory, so working with CPOs across a range of things in their people agenda. So I thought it might be helpful just to give a bit of background on who are we in terms of People Advisory and Grant Thornton, and why and sharing things on this topic today. So we're one team in Grant Thornton who work with HRDs to support them across a whole range of challenges on their kind of people agendas. And the reason that we've kind of come together as one team is that we consider everything across the people agenda to be so interlinked that we've brought all of those different skill sets and disciplines, whether that's from kind of tax, consulting, skills, learning development, all together to make sure that our solutions are really kind of holistic and kind of maximising the impact that we can have when we work with clients. So in that vein, throughout lockdown, we've held kind of frequent webinars and discussion forums on various topics around challenges that we've heard kind of HRDs in our network have been facing. We've really been listening to a lot of our network in terms of understanding what specifically is changing for them and what's the impact now, and how do they see that impact in the longer term. I guess also we've supported clients in new ways with their new challenges, and obviously as a business we've tackled that same challenges as everyone else, and we have a very kind of people oriented approach at Grant Thornton in terms of our strategy and decision making. So a combination of all of those things have given us a really good set of insights in terms of kind of how to help going forwards and what that new normal is. So I'll just hand over to Justin to talk a bit about the context and that changing landscape and what we mean when we talk about the new normal.
Thank you, Maddie. So I'm absolutely going to steer away from the word unprecedented, but I think it's probably fair to say that there's been quite a lot going on lately. Although much of 2020 has obviously been dominated by COVID, let's not lose sight of the fact that on top of that, there's been some pretty seismic changes which were already impacting organisations. You know, we can think about Brexit, the whole digital transformation process, and also a very welcomed increased focus on inclusion. Now, based on the results of our latest IBR survey, the International Business Review Survey, this is a biannual survey that we carry out with over 10,000 mid-market businesses across 30 different countries. I guess not surprisingly, almost 9 out of 10 UK mid-market businesses have made changes to their business model due to COVID. Possibly more surprising is the fact that these businesses, those changes have become baked into the new normal for them. Nearly half of businesses have had to adapt their strategy, or when I say had to, some of them have been done on the basis of having to take protective measures, or in others, proactively affect change for the benefit of the business. For many organisations, I think it's fair to say that the pandemic has been a catalyst for accelerating their plans for change. Clearly, one of the obvious effects of the pandemic was that many of us found ourselves suddenly working from home pretty much overnight. And reflected in that fact is that half of the businesses that we surveyed have implemented work from home or even flexible working practices where perhaps they didn't have any of them before. It will be interesting to see how many of these changes become permanent changes to the way organisations and their people work, but a bit more on that later. So at this point, we thought we would go to our first poll question, which we'll put up on the screen now. And the question we asked was, have you made any changes to your business strategy or business model since the start of the year? If we go to the results of that question, so of the people that were in the session, very interesting, that kind of 94% had some changes and 50% had very significant changes. So there was only a very small minority, 6% of the organisations that answered that poll who had seen no change. And if we go on to the next question, where an organisation has answered yes to the fact that they've had changes, how significantly has this impacted on the focus and priorities of the HR function? And again, if we go on to the results, again, similar number, 94% have had either significant or some changes, with a very, very small minority where there's been no change. So I think what that demonstrates is that it matches up with the results from the wider IBR survey that I was referring to, that there's been a very significant amount of change in business model strategy, and that is definitely flowing through to impacting on the HR function. Maddie, anything to add?
No, absolutely. Just to say that that's kind of completely in line with what we've heard from our kind of clients and broader HRD network, in terms of there have been significant focus and priority changes for the HR function, and kind of a capacity challenge to add to that change in activity and focus. I just wanted to talk about that a little bit now, in terms of what does that mean for what HR's focus and priority is. So in our IBR report that Justin referenced, we asked businesses what their key focus are for HR now. And again, all businesses would have experienced the last kind of 10 months really differently, but some of these themes we've been consistently hearing, talking about and working with organisations on. And I guess the top three of those are kind of the ones that we'll focus on today, in terms of what are those new focuses and priorities. So the first one is around ensuring safety in physical premises, and we've kind of combined that with agile working, in terms of how organisations managing their agile working alongside being in a kind of physical workplace, and how do they manage that employee experience whilst ensuring kind of effective delivery of everything that needs to be done. So the second one is around ensuring that people remain focused on priorities, which we've kind of coupled with the organisation culture conversation that we've had, given the kind of impact that they have on each other and what we've seen throughout lockdown. And again, more on that in a bit later. And then lastly is around skills. And skills always comes up as a hot topic whenever we talk to businesses around the people agenda. I think interestingly, there's been a real focus on specific skill sets, whether that be kind of the softer skills around coaching to support a workforce that's more aware and supportive around people's well-being and kind of psychological safety, or whether that's the more technical skills around kind of data and systems and that kind of thing. So if we just move on to the next slide, the poll question that we didn't ask in the session, but would just encourage people to reflect on, is what have those key focuses been for you? So we've added a couple of questions into this which are less COVID specific, thinking about the new normal a bit more broadly now, in terms of also thinking about inclusion and the impact of Brexit and anything else. What we've done is look at those three topics, so agile working and the physical workplace, kind of organisation culture and ensuring focus, and skills and inclusion as the kind of hot topics, just to reflect what have we heard, what have we learned from organisations, and what have we seen kind of work really well, and how is that impacting how HR are operating. So I'll just hand over to Justin, who'll kick us off around agile working. You're on mute, Justin.
Thank you. So just on agile working, and interesting, just reflecting on the question that was the poll question that we included there with the various different elements of focus. A lot of organisations, the answer to those is across a lot of the different items which we included. And I think that's very reflective of the fact that when you're thinking about agile working and what you use the physical workplace for, that it needs to be considered across the whole operating model. We've kind of pulled out some of those here, but I think, you know, for many organisations at the beginning of the lockdown and the early stages of the lockdown, there was an immediate focus around safety and the physical and mental well-being of their people, clearly. As the lockdown has continued and organisations are starting to think about the longer term implications of this, and actually what they'll go back to is unlikely going to be the same as they left before lockdown, then it will be important to ensure that where you do have people within the organisation who are working in different patterns, be that some of it working from home or different hours, that it's crucial that everyone has a consistent and complementary experience, regardless of where and when they do their job. So this will require, in effect, this to be built into the culture of the organisation. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I did want to pick out a couple. The first being outcomes focused. Often the easiest measure for productivity, you know, what people are doing, is based on input. If you can see someone at their desk between 9 and 5, then you can be reasonably comfortable that they are doing something. However, obviously this becomes far more difficult where you have people that are potentially working different hours, or they're in different physical spaces, indeed lots of working from home. So this means you need to think about flipping that and measuring output rather than input, which arguably is often a better measure anyway, albeit it's a little bit more challenging in terms of determining what those measures should be. I also wanted to bring out the leadership part, because this is absolutely critical to implementing a successful agile working program. That of accountability and trust is normally a really big factor in whether this is going to be successful or not, and the leadership, and it's not just the people right at the top of the organisation, but all the way throughout the organisation, will need to take a bit of a leap of faith that people will get on with their jobs and focus on the things that they need to. I mean, interestingly, lots of organisations we've spoken to, one of the things that has come out of the lockdown has been that the people in their organisations have demonstrated that this is absolutely the case, that they are focused on the things that they should be doing, and that they are working as hard, if not harder, sitting at a desk 9 to 5. So the last 8 months or so has also been the catalyst for many organisations thinking about what they use their physical workspace for and how they get the maximum value for what is, for many organisations, a very significant cost. So are there aspects of people's job that demonstrably they can do perfectly well from home? And is it therefore important to focus the workplace on those activities where you get the most out of people doing and being in the same physical space? So that might be such things as, onboarding new hires, bringing new people into the business, collaboration, training and development, and also just that being able to ensure that you're reinforcing your organization's culture. Having said all of that, it is really important, and I think lots of organizations have recognized this, that you do keep some space for those employees where it is difficult for them to, for whatever reason. It may be that kind of just practically it's not set up that way, or for their mental health it's very poor, or it's just not safe for them to be working from home. So in those situations, you absolutely need to have somewhere that they can come in and do their job. In doing all of this, in kind of having these different arrangements that may well be baked into the organisation kind of permanently going forward, it is really important to make sure that you're not creating that two-tier employee experience that I touched on before. So wherever they're working, employees feel and are actually part of the team. I'm now going to hand over to Maddie, who's going to touch on culture.
Thanks, Justin. So something else that we have heard organisations talking a lot about, and kind of has had a real increased kind of focus and priority in terms of moving up the strategic agenda, is around organisation culture. And the reason that we've linked that to focus is that very early on, as we went into lockdown, we really saw the impact that a strong organisation culture had on being able to shift and kind of pivot the kind of workforce focus to where that needed to be as quickly and as effectively as we all needed to, kind of among all the changes that were being made. So we saw that happen really well for organisations who had a really good culture that was embedded kind of relatively consistently throughout, and kind of championed at all layers of leadership throughout the organisation. And we also saw organisations who struggled and met with a bit more resistance to changes to ways of working, kind of specifics of kind of activity within roles, things like kind of furlough envy, which was a phrase we didn't expect to hear as much of as we did, as people were kind of wanting to be furloughed rather than kind of being in work due to the kind of remuneration side of things. So we've seen the impact that the culture has on kind of workforce focus really strongly. So we wanted to talk about those together today. So this is the kind of culture web, Johnson and Scholes culture model, and it just looks at the different manifestations of an organization's culture. And one of the reasons that we use it with our clients and find it really helpful is that if you kind of look at what are these different things telling you? So what do the stories that people tell each other about what it's like to work there, and what are the kind of achievement stories and stories of organisation failure? How are they told, and what's the language used? And compare that to your organisational structures. Are you kind of very hierarchical or relatively flat structure? Is there lots of kind of collaboration built into the org structures, or are they relatively siloed? Combine that with the other kind of elements of that culture web there, what you start to see is it's a very kind of tangible way to get an understanding of what is the culture saying at the moment. And once you've got that understanding of what it is, it's easier to map intentionally and deliberately where you want the culture to be in order to kind of enable you to achieve what you're trying to achieve. So we've spoken with clients about that and used that in conversations with our networks throughout lockdown to say, where are you having challenges, and how does that sit, and kind of how is that manifesting, and what can you kind of tangibly change in order to achieve that culture that will allow you to pivot focus really quickly, engage workforce, and have people kind of engage organisation through the culture. And I guess just touching on purpose quickly, we've seen organisations kind of question and slightly reposition their purpose throughout COVID, and where that's happened, we've seen that be really effective, and kind of arguably more effective than we'd seen that happen before. And I think given a kind of relatively unifying, broader kind of macro context, a purpose that speaks to that and helps people to understand the organisation's role in that broader kind of context and macro environment is really, really powerful. So we've seen that done really brilliantly and be incredibly effective in terms of engaging the workforce. Moving on more specifically then to focus, once you have your organisation culture where you want it to be, where we've seen this really kind of come alive is really through the employee value proposition. So people, policies, processes, practices from hire to retire. We've seen lots of clients pivot that and start to look at how can we make this and keep this relevant to people now in the new kind of way that they're engaging with our work, whether that's remotely or in a physical workplace. How can we make that feel consistent across both of those, and how can we keep it relevant to the value sets and what people are kind of have in front of their mind right now? So whether that's looking at what are the benefits that you offer to people, and have you considered that people might be thinking much more about the healthcare and well-being than they might have valued that previously in that package? How do you support people from a performance management perspective remotely? Does that work as effectively with the kind of culture that you have now, or does that need tweaking? So we've seen people really successfully make kind of relatively small tweaks, but just ensuring that consistency around their employee value proposition. We've seen that work really well in terms of delivering clear focus on the priorities at hand. I guess the other thing, just to build on that, is the line manager population. That population has either been a real enabler for people or a bit of a barrier. We've not worked with anyone yet who's referenced their line manager population as being the perfect population, but where they are well supported in terms of the skills that they need with the additional pastoral care needs that have become part of their role now, where they have an understanding of what their role is, and they have the capacity and capability to deliver against that. We've seen that group really be able to kind of maintain and harness engagement, discretionary effort and focus, and kind of on the flip side, where that kind of line manager population is kind of maybe less well selected or managed actively, we've seen that become a real blocker, and therefore kind of shift up the priority list from an HR perspective in terms of making sure those are the right people, and that the right kind of significance and weight is put on that part of their role, rather than being a kind of side of desk to an already incredibly full operational role. So I'll just hand back over to Justin now to touch on skills.
Yeah, thank you, Maddie. So, from a skills perspective, I think, it's absolutely the case that the pandemic for many organizations has driven a rapid change to their business models. And as firms, many organizations have had to pivot, they've had to do much more digitally. And we've seen this that in a survey that almost 44%, so nearly half organizations have identified that they have a digital and IT skills gap. And obviously, when we talk about digital, that's a very wide range of things, from kind of the data analytics through to cyber into digital marketing. So how can you secure these skills? Obviously one option is to go to the market and buy them, but with everyone out chasing the same skills, this is expensive, and always bringing new people into the organization carries an element of risk. The other option is actually to develop the new skills within the business that you need to drive the business forward. Now, this is obviously not as quick as buying those skills in, but there is less risk associated with it for the business. And those people that you are reskilling effectively already have a very important piece of the knowledge, which is that they know and understand the business itself. So, for example, if you as an organization are having to have redundancies, you may be able to think about those employees that you can keep in the business by training them for new roles. Clearly, if this is something that you're going to do, you're going to need to think about this as early as you possibly can, because clearly you can't build skills overnight. I'll hand over to back to Maddie to build on the inclusion piece.
Thanks, Justin. Absolutely. So I guess from an inclusion perspective, we've seen a renewed focus on that societally, from a regulatory perspective as well. Consumers and employees all have changing and increasing expectations around inclusion, and happily so. We all know that a kind of more diverse workforce is a more effective workforce, and I think kind of lockdown and this change in way of working that many of us have had is a real opportunity to drive a more inclusive culture. The model on screen is our inclusion maturity model, and looks at the different stages of kind of inclusion maturity that an organisation can go through. But I guess just wanted to touch on, because this has been such a good opportunity for different people with different kind of characteristics and background to access the workplace in a way that they might not have been able to before. We know that kind of lockdown has been a really positive period in some ways for people with disabilities in terms of how they access work, because organisations have had a real focus on making sure that work is accessible from a home environment, and whatever that home environment might look like. We also know it's been really positive for kind of working mums or people kind of returning to work, again easing that transition back in and being much more flexible around other kind of roles that people may have in their lives. So with that opportunity, I think it's just really important to measure and focus on the inclusion side of the diversity and inclusion. So looking at how included people feel whilst they are at work, as well as just their different characteristics and what that means from a kind of data perspective. That gives you a really effective baseline to use to monitor your kind of progress in real time. And where we've seen people focus on that inclusion side and take a really data-led approach to that, we've seen them able to kind of shift that up the strategic priorities of their organisation and drive much quicker and much more measurable change against that. And considering this inclusion as you're considering the skills gaps that you might have, or from a strategic workforce planning perspective, is a really effective way to make sure that you are systemically building that in to your new way of working and your kind of new normal as an organisation. So if we can just move on to the next slide. So there we've touched on kind of three of the kind of key topics that we've heard people talking about. Hopefully some of those insights have been helpful in terms of what we've seen working really well. We just wanted to bring the focus back to, so what does that mean for HR? This is a kind of HRD scorecard, as we call it, and effectively it looks at the different roles that an HRD or an HR function can play. So the four sections, just to kind of talk around them quickly, starting kind of bottom right being operational delivery. So that's the very kind of basic HR delivery tasks. So that's kind of getting things done, whether that's payroll, if that sits within HR for your organisation, recruitment, kind of maintaining the establishment and employee records, the very kind of transactional activity that HR need to do. Moving left from that, so then there's the business protection, so making sure that controls, processes and governance are all in place. So is the organisation discharging its responsibilities from a compliance perspective? So health and safety is a good example of something that often sits within HR scope that would kind of sit in there. Other things like reporting on remuneration and pay, that kind of thing. Moving up to the top half then, so value creation. So that's around the strategic activity that really adds value to the organisation. It informs and drives the strategic decision making that happens. And a kind of, I guess in that area, we've seen a lot of additional activity from HR functions over the last year. And then stakeholder management being the last quadrant. So that's pulling together all of the relevant stakeholders for HR, namely the kind of leadership team, unions critically, and the workforce in terms of understanding the engagement and position of all of those kind of stakeholder groups to drive and achieve that people agenda and organisation strategic objectives. So why I'm kind of talking through that, one of the reflections that we've had is that organisations, all kind of HR functions play a slightly different role in their organisations. Some may focus primarily on the operational delivery, where an organisation isn't kind of strategically that focused towards its people. Others may kind of do the whole set with a real emphasis on the value creation, having automated some of the operational delivery and business protection. What we've heard from organisations over the last year is that a lot of kind of what previously might have been considered value creation activity has been shifted into a business protection bucket, and the kind of broader business and leadership teams have really focused on and required a lot more kind of value creation activity than they might have done before. And what that means for an HR function, it might mean that they have a challenge in terms of capacity, simply a stretch. It might also mean kind of skills and capability challenges, in that there's a whole suite of very kind of strategic activity that needs to be delivered that there aren't necessarily templates and kind of models for in-house. A real opportunity for some top HR talent to shine. But from an HRD perspective, what we've kind of seen and what we've heard is HRDs are really feeling the kind of brunt and pressure of all of that landing with them in terms of trying to enable their teams to deliver that additional activity, feeling responsible for a lot of the delivery themselves, including whilst all of the other HR activity, whether that's operational delivery or business protection, stakeholder management, is much more complex than it would usually be anyway, so requiring additional support. So we didn't get onto this poll question in the session, but would just encourage people to reflect on, for you, has there been a significant shift in focus, either for you personally or for your team, in the role that you've played, and what has that shift looked like? What we kind of typically have heard and what I would expect to see if we were to do the poll would be a shift towards the kind of value creation and stakeholder management, and the expectations of that really quickly shifting kind of overnight as COVID impacted, being a kind of people-led challenge. I've yet to speak to an HRD with no real change in focus, but would be really happy and interested to hear from any HRDs who are kind of in that bucket as well. So just moving on to the next slide. So once you kind of had a think through that, what can you do, and what in our view are some of the key considerations moving forward? So the top one I've touched on a little bit already in terms of it's a really good opportunity to reflect on what are the skills and capabilities that you require in HR. So is that the same as it was before, or actually are there new roles, new skills that you need to bring into the business to be able to deliver what the business needs now and what the business expects going forwards? Subsequently to that, then thinking about from a capacity perspective, is the function well enough resourced? There's been a real kind of strain on HR functions consistently, and we've had a lot of kind of burnout and fatigue for people working in HR functions due to the kind of significantly increased workload that they've had. I think people and functions were kind of able to sustain that for a while, moving into this new normal and with kind of changing rules and ways of engaging your workforce kind of continuing to change and looking like they will do for the foreseeable future. It's a good time to reflect on, actually, is there a requirement for an increased capacity, appreciating that there is also a cost restraint on businesses. So maybe the capacity comes from making a change from a system perspective and being able to automate more activity, or kind of leaning out processes in order to enable some of the capacity that's sitting at a more transactional level to be upskilled and move into that more strategic kind of value creation layer that we've seen so much of. And then to think about alternative delivery models just to support that. So systems is one way, but maybe kind of outsourcing or kind of creating joint ventures, shared service centres. It is another good way to kind of maximise the efficiency of delivery and kind of minimise the cost. So then the next bit is around leadership and line managers. So this is really about seeing HR as the kind of driver and facilitator of the people agenda, with leadership and line managers being critical kind of delivery capacity for that agenda, and making sure that both leadership and line managers have the skills and capacity in order to deliver against that. That massively supports from a resilience perspective going forwards, and will be kind of absolutely critical as the new normal continues to morph as it has been. And then the last thing is just around reviewing strategic alignment. So how much as a kind of HRD or as an HR team have you had the time and capacity to sit back and look at the new landscape and reflect on how does that change what we were doing before? How does that change our kind of people strategy that we'd built for the next 5 years? We've paused that temporarily whilst kind of a lot of this change has been going on. It can't be paused forever. We need to start to revisit and review. How does that look now? What do we need to build our new people strategy to be going forwards? And I'll just hand over to Justin to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, so if we'll come on to the last slide now, and as Maddie said, clearly the challenge here, has over the last however many months has been that it's all hands to the deck in terms of those kind of carrying out those things that Maddie has just been speaking about. That doesn't really give you the time and space to think about that, kind of from a strategic perspective, where should you be focusing your time and efforts. But if we think about, from our perspective, when we're talking to our clients about this, we've kind of got three steps in this. The first is try and make that time to step back and review your people strategy. Second piece is then when you're considering each element of your people strategy, how does that change given the change in priorities and context of the current situation, and then bringing all of that together in terms of thinking about, well, what are the actions, what are the priorities that you need to take to turn that into a deliverable plan. Now, the way that we do it is what we call an HRD room, and spend half a day facilitated workshop, taking an HRD through the various elements of a kind of the things that they need to be thinking about, be it internal, external, leadership, etc., etc. And then the output from that is a clear list of, these are the things that we need to focus on, and this is the priority, and this is the support that they need to be able to put that into case. Very happy to talk. Anyone who's interested in finding out more about that, obviously very happy to either talk to myself or Maddie, and we'll kind of give you a bit more detail. But however you do it is kind of going through those 3 steps. I think will be a very good starting point in terms of taking all of this stuff that we've just covered and turning that into, well, what does the HR function look like over the next 6, 12, 18 months, 2 years, whatever. So thank you very much. That's the end of our session. Second time round lucky, hopefully. And as I say, any of that you want to pick up with Maddie or myself, our contact details are there, and we'd be delighted to talk to you.